On the 80th anniversary of VJ Day, live from the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, I'm Kasia Madera. This is BBC News. King Charles pays tribute to the service and sacrifice of veterans in a special message marking the 80th anniversary of victory over Japan, ending the Second World War.
The courage and camaraderie displayed in humanity's darkest hour is a flame that shall blaze for eternity, a beacon that honours our past and guides our future.
It's been 80 years since the people of Japan heard the Emperor's voice for the first time, announcing that the war had been lost here. Today, the country observed a minute's silence in solemn remembrance.
We'll bring you a special programme covering that poignant ceremony in half an hour's time, right here on BBC News.
I'm Adina Campbell in London. Also coming up, President Trump says he believes President Putin is ready to make a deal as the two leaders prepare for talks in Alaska later. Israel faces a barrage of international criticism after approving a long-delayed plan to build thousands of homes in the occupied West Bank.
King Charles has paid tribute to the service and the sacrifice of those who fought to bring an end to the Second World War 80 years ago. Special commemoration events and a service of remembrance will be taking place here at the National Memorial Arboretum in the presence of those few remaining veterans who saw the brutality of the campaign in the Far East and the Pacific. 80 years ago, of course, Imperial Japan offered its unconditional surrender, thus bringing an end to the deadliest conflict in human history to a close. Well, special events have been taking place. A little bit earlier on today, we heard the lament from the lone piper at the cenotaph. Well, pipers also played in the National Memorial Arboretum here in Staffordshire and also at Edinburgh Castle as part of the many events taking place to mark that 80th anniversary, marking the end of this deadly conflict that was fought by so many. They gave up so much so that the world would be free. We'll be looking at the various different events taking place, but first let's look back at those events 80 years ago. Here's my colleague, Charlotte Gallagher.
A sunset ceremony to mark the essential contribution of the Commonwealth to the Second World War. One of the first national events to mark the anniversary of VJ Day. It was 80 years ago today when millions of people across the world heard the news they'd been waiting for.
Japan has surrendered. So let us join in thanking Almighty God that war has ended throughout the world.
After years of sacrifice, suffering and worry, World War II was finally over. The intense fighting in the Far East and Pacific, which went on for months after victory in Europe was declared, had come to an end. In London and across the UK and Commonwealth, people took to the streets. Celebrations went on for days. King Charles, whose mother and grandparents celebrated on the balcony of Buckingham Palace 8 decades ago, is leading the nation's tributes today. He's recorded a message saying those who fought for freedom shall never be forgotten.
We must not lose sight of how great was the cause and how sweet the victory. For those heroes of VJ Day gave us more than freedom. They left us the example of how it can and must be protected.
More veterans aged between 96 and 105 will be the guests of honour at a service at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire today. The event will begin with military bagpipers before a 2-minute silence at noon and an RAF flypast featuring the Red Arrows, a Spitfire, Hurricane and Lancaster. This may be the last significant anniversary which veterans of the conflict will be able to attend. Their number becomes smaller every year. The generation that gave so much so future generations could have freedom. Charlotte Gallagher, BBC News.
And it's the veterans that are very much at the centre of the events today, but also the memory of those who didn't make it back. Now, there are numerous memorial sites here across the National Memorial Arboretum, but this one is particularly poignant. This is a real part of the Burma Railway that was described as the Death Railway. 16,000 prisoners of war used as slave labour by the Imperial Japanese Army laid 400 kilometres of this track between Thailand and Burma, now of course Myanmar, and so many died in the brutal conditions, cutting through rock, cutting through jungle, that it's said that each sleeper represents a life lost. So it's that brutality of the Japanese Imperial Army that is really difficult and that made this campaign in the Far East and the Pacific so brutal for the prisoners of war and of course for the soldiers themselves. And it's the legacy of that that Japan is struggling to deal with, as my colleague in Tokyo, Shaima Halil, now explains.
This is a day of somber reflection. Not very far from where I am, the Emperor Naruhito, Empress Masako and the Prime Minister led a minute's silence, praying for the dead, but also honoring those who died. More than 3 million people died during World War II. It's a day of remembrance of the suffering, as the Emperor put it, not just to people in Japan, but the immense suffering and pain that was inflicted by the Japanese Imperial Army onto its neighbors, whether it be Korea, China, or across Asia. Where I am right now is a very controversial location. I am at the Yasukuni Shrine, and hundreds of people have been making their way all through the morning and the afternoon to pay respects for the hundreds of thousands of Japan's war dead. But along those, there are also Class A war criminals that are being honored in this shrine, including the wartime leader Hideki Tojo, who was executed in 1948. And it is seen by Japan's neighbors and by its critics as a symbol of the country's unrepentance to its atrocities during World War II, glorification of what its Imperial Army has done to its neighbors. It's also politically quite controversial because we've heard that earlier in the day, the Agriculture Minister Shinjiro Koizumi has made his way here to pay respects. It's a very first confirmed attendance by a sitting cabinet minister in the current cabinet. So, in a way, 80 years ago, the Japanese have heard the voice of their emperor for the first time, announcing defeat and ushering in the post-war era that pushed Japan into a modern, prosperous democracy. And yet, there is a festering sense that this country hasn't fully atoned to the atrocities by its military in World War II, the way that Germany, for example, has atoned to its Nazi past.
Shaima Halil there on the legacy and the complexity of Japan and the history of what is known as the deadliest conflict in human history, because it was thousands of people, tens of thousands became prisoners of war, tens of thousands lost their lives. Those who did return are honoured, and that is what today is really about, remembering the veterans. 33, ranging from age of 96 to 104, are here today in the presence of their Majesties King Charles and Queen Camilla. And the King issued that statement earlier on today that their service, their sacrifice must be remembered. And that is what today is all about. And that's what the Royal British Legion is working so hard to do in order to keep those memories alive. And Anthony Metcalfe, who works for the Royal British Legion as Head of Community Engagement, joins us now. And Anthony, you have so many different connections when it comes to why we're here today, not least your father, Douglas, was a Burma Star veteran. Let's start with him. I know he died when you were very, very young, but what are your reflections? Because I know you've done an awful lot of research into his life?
Yeah, I think I can start off by saying today's going to be a very emotional day for all involved. I mean, we're so proud to support and enable those 33 veterans to be here today. But certainly many people here today have a connection to that Far East campaign and the Pacific War. I mean, my own father, Douglas Metcalfe, was in the Royal Marine Engineers. He was called up in early 1941 and finally demobbed in 1946. So a whole 5 years later. I know he was very busy across Ceylon and Africa and also the islands, setting up motor torpedo bases, cutting out the jungle, making airfields, all that sort of activity that supported the actual, the bombing campaign of Japan, for example. He died when I was only 5 years old. Like a lot of his generation, he didn't talk about his experiences. So now I spend a lot of my own personal time trying to track down and uncover what his real Second World War journey was. But like all those that fought in the Second World War, I'm immensely proud of him.
And rightly so. And what your words here on this card, long may you all be remembered.
Absolutely.
Because that's the point, that so many people see VE Day as the end of the Second World War. But for your father, for his colleagues, it was far from over and the conditions were horrendous.
Oh, absolutely. They were brutal. It really was a very brutal war. And I think, understandably, when VE Day happened on the 8th of May, it was on our doorstep. People finally believed that the war in Europe was over. And the majority of those who fought, in the Western campaign were from the UK nations, for example. Those that fought in the Far East were far more diverse. The largest in the Indian Army, the 2.5 million volunteers, for example, tens of thousands from African nations, from the Gurkhas, for example. It was a very, very diverse campaign. So possibly there's a slight watering down of veterans who returned after VJ Day. And like my dad, many of them didn't come home for a year afterwards. There wasn't a plane you could jump on. It was a 3-month boat journey, for example. And I think by then, most of them just want to get on with their lives, put the war behind them and not talk about their experiences. But it's really crucial that 80 years later, we remember all those that fought for our freedom.
And that's it, isn't it? It was such a multinational force, the whole world coming together to fight. And from my understanding, the 14th Army, for example, had 100 different languages. It's extraordinary. I wonder if something like this could ever be brought together again.
No, I think, the fact it was a world war, speaks volumes. As you mentioned, the 14th Army under the amazing General Bill Slim was one of the most diverse armies that ever fought, 100 different languages. How they got on to work together, how they worked, communicated together was absolutely amazing. But they're a very efficient and effective fighting force. And that was down to all of their skills and all their backgrounds, the many nations that they came from.
And you're going to be laying that wreath in the presence of His Majesty King Charles. He issued a really poignant statement, didn't he?
Yes, absolutely. I think, it's important that we do reflect on those events 80 years ago. We remember the diversity of the Second World War campaign. And if I'm honest, in these sort of slightly troubled times that we live in today, we must always remember there's more things that make, join us in our common goals than separate us, really. So it's really important that we remember that we came together 80 years ago as a world to defeat fascist Germany and Imperial Japan. And that peace was hard fought by, and we must never let that slip.
How do you keep the memory alive once the last of our veterans goes?
It's really important for us. We work very, very closely with schools and other youth organisations. We have a massive teaching remembrance resource on our website, for example. But I'm always amazed about just the curiosity and the interest of young people today who want to find out about these experiences. Sometimes you knock them, but actually they're really, really keen on this. So I guarantee anybody who's got military experience today, speak to their kids, speak to their grandkids about it. It's really important that we pass on those experiences and we pass on the flame of remembrance to the next generation.
So we're in good hands for the next generation. Anthony Metcalfe from the Royal British Legion, thank you so much for talking to us and sharing the extraordinary story of your father, Douglas. Thank you. And that's exactly what this is about today. People like Douglas's memory being remembered, the veterans that are still here with us, 104 years old, the eldest. Incredible remembrance of what they experienced, the brutality of it, but also the camaraderie. These people don't forget their colleagues who fell, and that's ultimately what this is all about here today. We will be bringing you special coverage of the Remembrance Service taking place a little bit later on, but from the National Memorial Arboretum here in Staffordshire, we'll be back throughout the next few hours.
Kasia, thank you. That's Kasia Madera at the National Memorial Arboretum, as she said, in Staffordshire.